Hello everyone, it's Marion from Wool Thread Paint here, and it's time for another video tutorial. Today's one is going to run alongside the pattern for the Blair Atholl blanket for those of you who are currently making this pattern. And I'm going to be showing you the interlocking block stitch. Now this is the stitch that I decided on when I originally thought about making this blanket. I was more interested in the colours of the area around about the village of Blair Atholl. I explain it all in the pattern, so you've probably read all about it already. This is a village in Highland, Perthshire in Scotland that we visit as often as we can. And there are rivers and hills and trees and lochs and lots of walks, and I've got hundreds of photos, and I wanted to make a blanket which used the colours that are in my memory from this area. I had thought about granny squares and various other geometric patterns, but I always came back to the idea of a stitch that was going to give me a tweedy look, which to me just encapsulates everything about Scotland. So here we are. This is the interlocking block stitch. It's a very easy stitch to do, but once you start, you can rattle through it reasonably quickly. The plus about this stitch is that you do get this lovely shaded effect, so you don't get stripy rows because the rows are interlocking. The other plus is that it's just 2 treble stitches in UK terms, double crochet in US terms, with 2 chains in between, and it makes a double-sided fabric. So it's exactly the same on the back as on the front, and it's also thick because there's an element of working over a piece. If I pull that apart, you can see a little bit of the grey showing underneath, so you're almost making a double fabric. And so it makes it a very cosy, warm blanket, and also very flat and straight. It's very balanced. There's no twisting, no needing to block, anything like that. I'm using Stylecraft Special DK, which is an acrylic yarn, which I'm sure you know I use for most of my blankets. And I've also put in a little bit of this James C. Brett Stonewash, which again is an acrylic. And as you can see, it's a variegated one. I've got 3 different colours in this yarn, which I'm using with the Stylecraft Special, and that helps to add to the kind of blended effect of the blanket. So, as I said, I'm going to be showing you how to do the stitch today. This little sample is one that I've made just for photographing for the pattern, but it lets you see all at once the downside of the stitch. And so there has to be, if there are all these pluses, there has to be a negative, and of course it's all these ends. So you have 2 ends at the beginning of a row and 2 ends at the other end of the row. So do your maths. If there's 258 rows, you can tell that there are an awful lot of ends. However, the next video will show you how I go about creating a border which will trap the ends in between 2 layers and means that you don't have to sew them in. You don't have that horrendous job of sewing them in. But that's for the next video. Anyway, I shall start. So push this out of the way, get rid of all the tails, and I'm going to start with khaki. Now this is really all I've got left of the khaki colour that I was using, so although it's a bit of a straggly ball, I'll try and keep it out of camera. I could have actually found the end before we started filming, so give me a second. Here we are. And you want to chain, make a chain to start. You can use other methods for starting a blanket, but I'm just using the chain, and that's what I'm going to show you. So you make a loop. This is the way I start. Put my yarn, the long part of the yarn behind the loop, and pull it through. That's just the way I make a slip stitch. And you'll be chaining at least 200 for your blanket, but for this sample I'm just going to chain 30. You want to have excuse me, you want to have an even number of chains, whichever size you want to make it. So I'm going to chain 30. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And now I'm going to stop at the 10th one and just let you see, if I can show you, I've tried to keep my tension as loose as possible so that the chain will not do that and curl. Now I'm using my 4mm hook, and if you are a very tight crocheter you might want to go up to a 4.5 to do the chain, but if you can just try to keep, if I can hold that there, you can see just how loose, how open my chains are. That's what you really want to try and aim for to get a nice straight edge. So I was on 10, I'll continue, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 18, 19, 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 30. There we are. So that is my chain of 30. Did I hold that? I was looking at the chain. Maybe I've held that up out of the camera. But anyway, I've done my chain of 30 and I'm ready to start row number 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to yarn over because we're going to be doing treble stitch. And if you look at my chain, and if I take this chain, not the loop that's on the hook, but the first one after it, count that as 1, and then the next one as 2, these 2 chains we're going to miss, and we're going to actually make a treble stitch into the 3rd chain. So that's yarn over, put your hook in, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, and that's my first treble stitch. I'm going to do that again, yarn over into the next chain, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. So now you can see that I've got 2 treble stitches, and there's a little gap because I have this curly bit at the end, which were the first 2 chains which we missed out. Now I'm going to chain 2, and because I've chained 2, before I do my next treble I'm going to miss 2. Now there's the one that we've just done the stitch in, so I'm going to miss the next one and the next one and make my treble stitch in the 3rd chain along. It's all a bit wibbly wobbly at this point when you're trying to work into chains, and if you have chained too tight it makes it awkward, but if it's loose then it makes it so much easier. So that's a 1 treble and 2 trebles, and then chain 2. Do that again, miss 2 chains, go into the 3rd one along, 1 treble and another one in the next chain. That's all there is to it actually. Miss 2 and miss 2 chains into the third one with a treble and one in the next stitch. And there you can see it's a bit like a ladder. You've got your 2 treble stitches, you've missed the 2 chains but you've chained 2, so that keeps everything straight. 2 treble stitches, chain 2, miss 2, 2 trebles, and so on. So I'm going to work along to the end of this row and I'll come back when I'm ready to do the last part of this row and start the next. I've got to the end of my row now, apart from the last couple of chains and this knobbly bit at the end. So I've chained 2, I've done my 2 trebles and chained 2. I've got these 2 chain stitches to skip over, and then I'm going to put my hook into this knobbly bit at the end and start to make my next treble. But I'm going to stop when I've still got 2 loops on my hook. I'm not going to complete the treble because this is where we're going to change colour ready for the next row. So it's time to cut the khaki yarn and start with the next colour, which is the Stylecraft Special Meadow, which is a lighter green. Put this khaki out of the way because it's going to become a nuisance. It's just a big unravelled mess now really. And this is the meadow. So still with the end, we haven't turned onto the next row yet. We've still got to finish off the end. So we've got the 2 loops left on the hook. I'm going to bend my meadow yarn over my hook and just pull it through. And that's you got your new colour started. Now for this blanket, and because I'm going to be making the envelope border, what I do is then I find the starting end of my meadow and the finishing end of my, get the right one, finishing end of the khaki, and I'm going to tie them off in a knot. And that keeps, it's got 2 reasons. It keeps the last stitch nice and firm. It helps to keep the sides of the blanket nice and straight, and it stops them from trying to unravel themselves while you're making the blanket and before you come to trap them. It just holds everything a bit more securely. Now, as I'm saying this, if you do decide not to make the double border and you decide to make a single border, you will be sewing these ends in as you go, and I wouldn't put a knot in the end if you're doing that because it's an unnecessary bump on the end of the row. I would just sew them in after every 2 or 3 rows. Don't leave it until you've done 258 rows, otherwise you will really regret it, having all these ends to sew in. But this is only if you're doing any other border apart from the envelope one. Anyway, back to this one. So we've got a knot to put into my 2 ends, and I go back, right back to Girl Guide days, and I do a reef knot. So the reef knot is you put your yarn over the top of the other one and pull it through. That's easy. I pull it up as tight as I can, and that just holds everything firmly. And then I put the other yarn over and under and pull it through and pull it tight. And that's a reef knot, and that's me with my meadow yarn nice and firmly in place. I've got 2 ends that will just push out of the way because it's the long end that we're going to be working with. And before we turn it, I chain 2. And that's us ready to start row 2. Now with row 2, I've turned round and you can see we've got this big space right at the beginning. So I'm going to yarn over, and instead of doing any stitches into this top part, I'm actually going to make my treble stitches down in these two chain stitches from the very first foundation row of chains, which have been left empty. So I've yarned over and put your hook into the first of these two, pull your yarn through, yarn over, pull through two, yarn over, pull through two, and you can see what's happened. It has worked right over the top of this, the top two chains, and we're going to go down to the bottom and make another treble. So that's the very first two trebles made of these from these bottom row chains. Chain two and do exactly the same in the next. You need to look for your treble, your chain stitch, the first empty one, and the second one. And as I say, like any striped pattern for crochet, the very first two rows are always the most, I wouldn't say tricky, they're not tricky, but they're a bit loose and wobbly feeling, but honestly it becomes much firmer by the time you've done a few more of the rows. So there is the next two trebles, chain two and two more. I'll just do these ones. If you've got your foundation chain nice and loose, it's not difficult to find where to put your hook. Chain two, and there you can see what's happening. You've got this meadow coloured yarn coming right down and picking up the stitches from the bottom of the foundation chain. Now I'm going to work along again. I've only got 2 or 3 more to do. I'll do these and I'll come back when I've got to the end of the row. I've come along to just about the end of this row now, and I'm going to do my chain two, and then you've got this odd looking group of stitches, so it's kind of tricky to figure out where to put your hook. And I think that on other video tutorials for this stitch there are different methods of doing the beginning and end of these rows, so I'm going to show you the one that I feel works best for me, and it gives a nice straight edge. So I've done my chain two. I'm going to, you can see that there are 2 trebles, and then there's this funny bit where we did the initial, skipped over the initial 2 chains from the first row, and I'm going to yarn over and I'm going to just push my hook between the second of these 2 trebles and this funny chain bit on the end, and I'm going to start again another treble and leave it at that, and that's us finished with the meadow. Now in my my way of doing this stitch, every row is the same, and I'm not sure if that's happens with them all, but let's just stick with my idea. So I've got my new colour, and it's this nice variegated one, so you might begin to see some of the different colours coming through as I work along the 3rd row. So pull your yarn through and find the end of your green and tie your reef knot, and I pull it up quite tight so that it makes that loop that's sitting on the hook nice and firm, and make and then we can start chart. So we're going to chain 2 and then turn, and we're ready to go again. Now this time you're going to be working into, you're going to be skipping over this meadow colour and working into these 2 treble stitches from the very first row. So yarn over into the top of the first treble and make sure that you pick up both loops of that, the top of that stitch. Pull through two, pull through two. Yarn over into the next one and make another treble. Chain two, and we're ready to look for the 2 stitches in this next group. So over the top of this chain 2, that's just going to get hidden by the treble stitch, and another one, and chain 2. Now you can see how the interlocking part really begins to make the colours almost blend like a paintbrush would. So there's my 2 trebles and chain 2, and really that's all there is to it. And you can see how because we've jumped down to the previous row each time, you're not getting a straight run of a stripe, you are getting this stepped effect. So that's it. I'm going to go along to the end and I'll come back when I'm finished, just to let you see the way this variegated colour changes as we move along. And I might do a 4th row just to show you, and then it's up to you. So I'll see you when I'm back at the end of this row. And I have got to the end, and I've done my chain 2, and you can see that there is a bit of a space between the last 2 meadow stitches and where I chained 2 to start. So I'm going to yarn over and put my last treble in there and leave it with the 2 loops as usual, and I'm going to cut that one. And before I start the new row, you can see, can't you, that this variegated yarn is picking out some different colours as we go along. There's a kind of a gold, a brown, a grey going darker, and that really works in the blanket to give it that more mottled effect. So the next colour, I'm going back to my first sample. So we've done 1, 2, 3 rows, so we're going to be working with the going to be working with the cypress green for the 4th row. So I'll just do that, because what I'm going to do with this row is show you a couple of the potential mistakes that you might make, and keep an eye out for that. Right, so I'm going to start as usual by pulling through and tying this off. This takes me right back to brownies and girl guides, learning to tie all the different knots. But this is a useful knot. Right, so we've got the cypress. Don't make the mistake of starting to crochet with your short end. You'll soon find out when you run out of yarn that you've used the wrong one. Make sure you've got your long end, and chain 2 and turn. And yep, I'm going to work along with this. Now, one of the things I'll say at this point, the tops of my 2 treble stitches are showing up quite clearly as I look along here, but occasionally this treble stitch can sometimes, move over and hide the top of one of these stitches. So just push it out of the way to make sure you can see them. So I'm going to do a couple of these groups of trebles we're now working into the meadow stitches, as you can see, and again jumping over the 2 chains from the last row. Now, potential mistakes. When you're doing rows of 200 or more, it's quite, you can lose concentration as you're working along the row. It takes a good wee while to get from left to right when you're doing a big blanket, and especially when you're doing the same stitch all the time, you can be thinking of other things, or you can be maybe listening to the radio or watching TV when you can, and all that can take your concentration away. And I have found, to my cost, not in this blanket, I'm glad to say, but in my last blanket where I used this stitch, there were a couple of times where I made a mistake and didn't notice. And then it wasn't until I was 2 or 3 rows further on that I could see there was something wrong had happened, and it does show up in this pattern, and really the only thing you can do is pull back and do it again. So I'm going to show you the 2 mistakes that are quite easily made. The first one is you make your treble stitch as normal, and then you lose your place and you just make another 2 chains and move on to the next group, and all you've done is make 1 treble stitch in this section where there should be 2. That's kind of obvious, but believe me, it does happen. So just make sure that you do 2 treble stitches in one in each of those stitches from the previous row. That's the first mistake. And the second mistake that I've done is I've completely forgotten to jump over this and go down to the row below, and I've been maybe watching something, looked up watching something on TV, and I've put my 2 trebles in underneath the top stitches. Move on. I'll just, if I chain 2 and move on with this mistake, you can see what happens. So I'm doing it correctly this time into the 2 meadow stitches, but then you can see what's happened is that here I've created a big hole which is not showing in any other part. So what I suggest you do, and I got into that habit and I'm quite glad I did, was that at the end of every row I just go back quickly, check along that everything is correct, and then if there is a mistake you can change it at that point without too much pulling back. And if you do make a mistake once, you tend not to do it again. But there we go. And really that's the only place you can make a mistake with this pattern, because it's really just 2 trebles and 2 chains. So I'm not going to bother finishing the end of this row. I'm going to go back to my sample just briefly to finish off and to show you what happens with my the sides of my blanket. And you can see that apart from all these horrible ends, which we'll just push out the way, it's very straight. There's no undulation, no in and out, as long as you remember to put 1 treble stitch right at the end, and then when you turn it over you've got your treble stitch to work into your trebles here. You've done your chain 2 and you treble into these 2, and that is interlocking block stitch. It can also be found on Google if you Google snuggle stitch, because there was one lady from a blog, her name is Pip, and a few years ago she wrote a blog post about a blanket she made, and she called it was the blog is Meet Me at Mike's is the name of the blog, and she made her snuggle stitch blanket, which really took a trick with a lot of people, and it was this stitch, and she's got a tutorial online for that. So lots of people know about it as snuggle stitch, but the old name for it is interlocking block stitch. And yeah, that's it. Once you've mastered the first 2 or 3 rows, you can carry on and make the next 255 of them. The only other thing to mention, and I haven't got it in this sample yet because we haven't come to it, but there are parts in the blanket where I've done a block of this stitch but just in one colour. I think the biggest block has got 6 rows in one colour. Now of course when you've got that you don't need to finish off at the end. You can just make your last treble stitch and then chain 2 and turn, and you don't have to cut the yarn obviously. But yeah, that's it. So that's interlocking block stitch, and I'll be back shortly to show you my next video tutorial, which will be how to get rid of all of these pesky ends and trap them inside a neat envelope border. So I'll see you then. Bye for now. And before we go, finally before we go, here's a little PS to the end of this tutorial, because there is something slightly different you need to do for your final row. Now we've only got 4 rows on here, but let's assume that we're right at the very top. We've just completed the last row of the blanket, but there's still these gaps which you really want to fill in. And a lot of people have asked, because I don't think any of the tutorials that I've seen online actually address this. So I'm going to show you how to finish off with an extra row just to fill in this gap, and then your blanket is complete. So I'm going to keep the same colour, which in this case is the cypress. And so that was me finishing off that treble stitch. And I'm going to chain 2 and turn as normal, and I'm going to go down into this last group of 2 trebles into the row below to do my treble stitch, as you can see. And then I'm going to, if you can see the tops of these 2 stitches, which was the row below, the immediate row below, I'm going to make 2 double crochets, and then down to the next one and make my 2 trebles, and then 2 double crochets. Double crochet is UK terms, of course. In the US that would be classed as a single crochet, and the trebles that I'm talking about, they are known as double crochets. I really wish we had got all our terms standardized across the world and we wouldn't have this problem. So I'm doing 2 trebles into the gap and 2 double crochets to take me along to the next one. And there you can see that is finishing off the last row with a nice solid ending to it. So I'll just do another couple, and this is how to do the last part of the blanket. And double crochet, ready to start the border. And that's me signing off properly now for this tutorial, and I'll be back, as I said before, with the border. Bye for now.